Orthogonal frequency division multiplexing, OFDM, is a popular modulation method used in optical wireless communication. In fact, it is highly spectrum efficient. But because of Hermitian symmetry, we lose 50% of spectrum efficiency. I don't like these kind of statements. Yeah, but that's a statement made in many scientific papers. But let's look a little bit more in detail into these kind of statements. Let's have a closer look into orthogonal frequency division multiplexing and how it works and how spectrally efficient it is. Is it more spectrally efficient? And can we still afford a factor of 2 that we lose in spectrum efficiency? Well, in fact, let's compare it to pulse amplitude modulation. If we start with a high bandwidth signal, a high bitrate signal, the pulses must be short. And that makes it a high bandwidth signal because of the Fourier transform. If we make pulses short, the bandwidth will be large. Now, if the channel is frequency selective, or if there is dispersion on that channel, or if there is a low pass behavior on the channel, we get intersymbol interference. And what OFDM does is it takes the time samples and it converts these. So from time samples it makes a frequency domain representation. It uses an inverse Fourier transform. Every bit, every symbol will now be on a specific frequency. And if you do that, by the theory of Fourier transform, the symbols become long. So the footprint of every symbol in time frequency domain remains exactly the same. And what does that do to spectrum efficiency? Well, the FFT is an invertible operation. So the number of degrees of freedom that I have on this side is exactly the same as the number of degrees of freedom that I started off with. And the only thing in optical wireless communication, if I go from electrically modulating a laser or an LED to modulating a photodiode electrically, we live in a real world. We have real samples only. So this time domain signal must be real. It's not like modulated on a carrier where I have an in phase and a quadrature component, which could be interpreted as real and imaginary. It is all real. And that means that in the frequency domain we must impose certain restrictions on that signal to get a real signal. And for that we need to have certain symmetry or certain properties in the frequency domain such that the number of degrees of freedom, the number of samples that I have here, is the same there. If I'm talking about complex valued symbols in frequency domain, like I like to have QAM signals, quadrature amplitude modulation with a real and an imaginary part, then I tend to use complex valued numbers here, but I can only use half the degrees of freedom. And if I play the game in a fair way, the number of degrees of freedom in PAM and in OFDM are exactly the same. So it's equally spectrum efficient. So how does that message creep in that we lose 50% of spectrum efficiency in many of the scientific papers? I personally believe that it is all because some of our colleagues think in terms of a carrier. And if we modulate a real signal as intensity modulation on a carrier, we do like AM radio. We have an upper sideband and we have a lower sideband. So in the optical domain around the carrier, we use twice the bandwidth. So a fair statement should not be OFDM loses because of a need for Hermitian symmetry. The real statement should be intensity modulation only uses half of the available bandwidth effectively. So the spectrum efficiency remains the same whether we use pulse amplitude modulation or whether you use OFDM modulation. Still, there are good reasons to use OFDM. It's really the case that OFDM is popular in optical wireless communication. And that has everything to do with the response end-to-end, electrically to electrically, where low frequencies in modulation are transferred in a better way than the high frequencies. That has to do with the response of the laser, the response of the LEDs, the propagation channel sometimes attenuates high frequency modulation. The photodiodes could have some capacitance and attenuate higher frequencies. And then it's very attractive that we can play with how many bits per second per hertz we put on low frequencies modulation versus what we do at high frequency modulation. And that is why we like OFDM. in optical wireless communication, and not so much because of the reasons of spectral efficiency. And if you'd like to read more about our work on OFDM, on juggling with Fourier transforms and what that does in optical wireless communication, then it may be good to have a look into the title of this paper, Continuous Phase Flip OFDM in optical wireless. Well, in fact, it's a much broader debate on how we can handle a DC bias, how we can handle the bandwidth of the signal by playing with OFDM signals. And it remains the case that OFDM is a very good solution in optical wireless communication.